Okay, so today I'm going to talk about why I do not like 5e and why I don't play it. So, first of all, number one, it's corporate. I mean, Hasbro is a corporation. They own Wizards of the Coast. And this corporation is completely profit driven, 100%. I mean, the only goal of a corporation is profit. So they don't really fundamentally care about the game. They don't really fundamentally care about the players and about the hobby. When D&D was first invented, it was invented by these two guys, Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, who were really, really into this particular hobby. First of all, through tactics games, and then they were developing really what was a new game, and they developed it out of love and passion. Now, when they went over to TSR. TSR, of course, was a for-profit business, but it's not a big mega corporation like Hasbro. In other words, and the people that were in it were still people who loved the game. So it was, Gary Gygax was still writing a lot of the books up until one of the late '80s or whatever when he was kicked out. Number two, it's too easy. First of all, there's this 3 saving throws in order to die rule, which pretty clearly makes it difficult to die, almost impossible to die. There are people, apparently, who have tried to make bad decisions in 5e to see how long their character would live, and their character just wouldn't die. So that's obviously very easy, and if you're not convinced by that, there's also this hit point bump, where in basic D&D, the hit points were either D4, D6, or D8 per level. Then in AD&D 1 and 2, the hit points were usually either D4, D6, D8, or D10 for hit dice. And then in 5e, it's either D6, D8, D10, or D12. So, and there's a rule that's official now that you have max hit points at first level. That was always an optional rule. So, all that should tell you it's too easy. 3. It's a storytelling game, and has been, I think, ever since Wizards of the Coast bought the IP. Before then, I'm going to stick my neck out there and say it was not a storytelling game. It was either a tactical game of dungeon crawling and that kind of a thing, or it was a epic, heroic quest simulation game. It was one of those two to whoever was playing it, and often a combination. But a storytelling game is something very different, in my not-so-humble opinion. So a storytelling game is more like you are there to tell a story. You're participating in telling a story, and you want it to be a good story. And so it's more about role-playing your character and drama, not just role-playing, but dramatizing your character for the group. Doing things that your character would do, even if those are bad things, like even if those are tragic or something like that. There is this game from 1995, I believe, called Everway. It was a card-based, storytelling-based role-playing game. It had no mechanics to speak of at all. You had ability scores that were the 4 elements, and they were numeric, and that was the only numbers you had in the whole game, and the numbers were supposed to be interpreted by the GM. The GM interpreted what happened through the medium of these things that were sort of like tarot cards, and basically just interpreted what the pictures meant. There was no specified meaning to any of these cards. I think they had names like drowning in armor and pictures, and that's it. Now, this is a storytelling game, by contrast to Dungeons & Dragons. Now, guess who made Everway? Wizards of the Coast. I still have it. I think it's a great game as far as a storytelling game is concerned. Unfortunately, it flopped. It was shortly after that Wizards of the Coast bought Dungeons & Dragons. And my not-so-humble opinion is that they bought the Dungeons & Dragons IP so that they could make a storytelling game like Everway, but that they wanted a popular brand. And the problem I have with 5e is that if it's a storytelling game, the rules are all wrong. is not just there's too many of them, because you don't need very many rules for a storytelling game. It's that there are rules that are not necessary for a storytelling game, like hit points, armor class, to hit, the entire combat system. If you take out the entire combat system, much of the class benefits go away. If you take out the combat system, much of the purpose of magic goes away. Monster fighting is a really important part of a heroic adventure simulation. It's not an important part necessarily of a storytelling game, except insofar as you might narrate out how the battle goes. So it's more about creating an interesting battle, maybe, than creating a tactical battle. But that's not what Dungeons & Dragons 5e has. It has a tactical combat system. But it's a tactical combat system where it's almost impossible to die. I think that they have a storytelling game with completely mismatched rules. Number 4. It rolled back a couple of things that I think were very important to a lot of us. One was that in all the earlier versions of the game, it always said, this game is yours to change as you want. If you are the DM, you can make homebrews, house rules, you can change everything around, you can use different dice, whatever. So it was always meant to be this open-ended game. And the reason for that is, if you look into like the Secrets of Blackmoor documentary, there is an explanation of this, which is that Dave Arneson and friends got this idea from a 1890s war strategy game that was actually created for the U.S. military called Strategos. And Strategos had this concept that there is a referee who would adjudicate real-life, sort of realistic situations. So let's say your soldiers were on a hex that had a farmhouse on it, and there's a river that they can't cross to get at the enemy. They might ask the referee, what would be the mechanics for my soldiers on this hex to take apart the barn and put together a bridge to go over the river so I could get at the enemy? And then the referee would come up with something that was supposed to be realistic. And the concept of this is that would give an authentic simulation of war to train officers. Dave Arneson got a hold of this and really loved this whole concept of having this referee who could step in and adjudicate things, which means that the moves that players make open up infinitely, because you no longer are bound by the rules you can make by the mechanics of the game. You can think creatively and realistically in order to come up with ideas that don't have mechanics for them in the game. That was a critical part of Dungeons & Dragons, and it was critical all the way from its beginnings in 1974 through the 90s. Okay, and that sense to it of rulings over rules has been rolled back considerably to the point where apparently there's some verbiage about it somewhere in, I think, the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, but it is really buried, apparently. I didn't think it was there, honestly, until I got on debate with somebody on Facebook, and they actually, quoted me chapter and verse on it. And I stood corrected, and I was like, okay, so they did say something, but the guy admitted, yeah, but they really, really buried it. Okay, and so to me, that cuts right at the heart of what a TTRPG is, not just what Dungeons & Dragons is, because Dave Arneson invented the TTRPG. He invented role-playing games, okay, of any kind. And one of the key ingredients, what really makes a TTRPG is this rule of a referee from Strategos. So that is fundamental. And I think it's fundamental because what we really want, at least the people from my day, I think really want in a TTRPG, is a heroic quest simulation. And a simulation means you might fail. It's like, I love playing Dungeons and Dragons, that is old school Dungeons and Dragons, because I love finding out if I have it in me to be a hero. I want to be that knight in shining armor and be like, hey, can I slay a dragon? And so I feel like they really kind of took out that sense of it and took a lot of power away from the dungeon master and almost ruled things so much that one almost wonders if the dungeon master is even really needed to play it. And number 5. 5e to me feels like a video game, not a fantasy simulation. I think in the old days we were simulating either folklore or myth, or fairy tales, Arthurian legends, definitely fantasy fiction. Tolkien style fantasy fiction can be really felt in there, as well as sword and sorcery. And so I think that there's a sense in 5e though that it's feels more like a video game than an authentic simulation of a fantasy story. Because I think most of the classes have spells. Those that don't have sort of like special moves you can only use a certain amount of times per day or something like that. And it sort of comes off as kind of video game-ish to me, because that's often how video games are. It doesn't really make sense. It's not really realistic. It doesn't really feel organic to me as a fantasy story, but it's kind of like in a video game it sort of works, or in a computer role-playing game it kind of works because you need some kind of mechanics because it's just the computer arbitrating what's going on. And so all the rules need to be completely and utterly nailed down, which is why computer role-playing games are so different from tabletop role-playing games. So, and that, to me, that is artificial. It takes away from simulating fantasy and then becomes more like a computer game with bad graphics, and that doesn't have any graphics. So in conclusion, what I really got involved with TTRPGs for is that I wanted to have the experience in a game of going on an epic quest and kind of seeing, can I be a hero? Can I slay the dragon? And that requires a tactical game, one in which moves matter, in which there's a chance that my character might die. And when my character survives and slays that dragon, boy, does it feel good. Okay, by contrast, I think a storytelling game is something very different. And so I think what's going on here, the game got taken over by people who are just totally profit-oriented. They're just, they don't really care about the original players. They didn't really care enough to even make a good storytelling game. It's a storytelling game that has bad rules for a storytelling game, that has tactical simulationist rules, They didn't really care enough about the tactical side to make it worth playing because it's too hard to die. And they didn't really care enough about the role of the DM and the great effort that the DM does to, put out her or his work, as it were, of kind of this creative thing, which may not be a work of art. I mean, it's something that's fun and entertaining in and of itself, that the DMs work really hard on creating for our players. And there's a creative process, and they really kind of like gutted that creative process, both in the makings of campaigns and also in the execution of the DM, to undermine the DM's agency. So, all in all, I feel that 5e is an inferior product to TSR versions of the game. Now, there are advantages to 5e. I think the best thing that WotC ever did for Dungeons & Dragons is the Ascending Armor class system. It's a much easier way to do things. In fact, the whole D20 system is so much more elegant than the old fiddly rules of old school. And what I want to see more of is OSRs that are kind of like redos of old versions of D&D that use something more like the D20 system and have a much more streamlined set of core mechanics, but that still have the danger level of the old games and still basically are in spirit the same games. So that I think it would be easy to take Beckme or AD&D First Edition or AD&D Second Edition and make versions of them that are D20. So in conclusion, I feel that Wizards of the Coast turned this game that's about epic quests into a game that's about telling stories about epic quests. And in the end, their product is basically just a product that's made by people who don't care about us. If all they can contribute is streamlining the rules a bit, I don't really see that as a win. So I'm going to continue to play old school D&D and the OSR. Thank you very much. All right. Hope you've enjoyed this. Bye.